The news that came in last week, towards the end of the week, Rafael Nadal has called time on his glittering tennis career. How are you going to remember him?
As the guy who beat Roger too often.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the king of clay. I think that goes without saying because that was his home ground. That was his playground, to be honest, because he dominated like no one else on any other surface in the history of tennis, maybe. And he was an impeccable opponent. He'd never say die, never quit attitude. What he was like as a youngster, fulfilled his potential, became a legend, and was still that legend towards the end. Because a lot of guys peter out in the end and they fizzle out in the end. You're like, it was maybe 2 years too much because you're still competitive, but I keep hearkening to Venus Williams, and I probably should stop saying that. But there's probably more bad Venus years than we've had good years. And you're like, I know you love the game, but I want to say Venus Williams' greatness. Like I was able to say Serena Williams' greatness because those two were great tennis players. But not so with Nadal because till the very end he was competitive. You needed to get a Djokovic to get him out of there. You needed to get an Alcaraz to get him out of there. And most latterly in a Grand Slam, maybe it's right quite early, but we know what happens with his body and injuries. But how late he was in his career, how late into his career he's winning Grand Slams and being competitive and pushing guys who are new on the circuit. That's amazing. That's amazing. And I mean, he's a GOAT specifically on the clay surface, but also a GOAT on all surfaces and just in the game of tennis. Because when you look at how he competes, how he's revered by his competitors, and how he just keeps going. If the game is deep, that's because Nadal is keeping it going, and he's against the ropes, but he's keeping it going, and eventually outlasts whoever he's up against. I mean, you bemoan the fact that Roger should have won that game because he's up against Verdasco with a day less rest, having played for 5 hours.
Yep.
Outlasting Federer even after all of that, because if the ball is still in play, Nadal is going to return it. And I think that's the great testament to any player that I don't care how crafty you are, how well you hit the ball. If it's going to bounce, I'm going to get to it. And he got to it way too often in terms of how he's beating the opposition and getting the titles as well. So what I remember of Rafael Nadal is that unbeatable, unstoppable, sometimes immovable in terms of his mentality, in terms of that particular clay surface. And yeah, man, an all-time great.
Yeah, I think his legacy is quite beautifully wrapped up by, if you ask a lot of the tennis players who played during his era, who's your toughest opponent? A majority name Rafa, right? And for me, that says everything you need to know about Rafael Nadal. He's the most competitive athlete I've ever seen. I have never watched a Rafael Nadal match and thought to myself, he's out of it, even when it looked as if he's out of it. And he never believed that. While he was out on the court, he was positive, he was bouncing around, he was running to the service line, and he always held a belief that he can come back and win. So his will to win and his competitive spirit, it was unmatched in my opinion. Also, I think Rafael Nadal in his peak on clay is the toughest assignment in the history of sport. If you were tasked to go try beat Rafael Nadal on clay, yeah, for the majority of his career, you knew he's going to win that match. He had that crazy, I think, 88 game winning streak on clay. He's got the 14 Grand Slam titles from Roland Garros, where he's 112-4, having won his first Grand Slam there in 2005. And to have the longevity to win those slams, to spend a record 912 weeks in the top 10, while being a guy who we thought to ourselves, maybe he's not even going to make it to 30 because of the style of play and how much he punishes his body and how his body continues to break down later in the year. But time and again, Chuck, was on the rehab table. He was working to get himself back in shape even this year, where you thought maybe you shouldn't have come back after the latest injury. But he wanted to go out on his own terms, and he wanted to find out if truly was it all spent. And that's the thing. He spent the entirety of his talent as well as his athletic gifts and his drive out there on a tennis court. And for me, you also think about him as rightly as the king of clay, but how he went beyond what you used to think about traditional clay quarters, that on the faster surfaces, they're going to struggle. And initially with Nadal, it was maybe something similar where you didn't expect him to win Wimbledon or even like the US or the Australian. But there were signs, his 5-setter against Federer coming back to beat Federer, I believe, in Miami. And then the Wimbledon trilogy against Federer was everything I needed to know about him beyond just accepting that he's good on clay and resting on his laurels, right? Where you could have just done that, because if he ended up with 14 Grand Slams, that's as many Grand Slams as Pete Sampras has in total if he just got them on the one surface. But he was never satisfied with that. He loses to Federer the first time in 2006 in 4 sets. He wins a set, but Federer is comfortable. He bagels him in one of those sets. In 2007, he takes him to 5 sets, but Federer wins 6-2 in the final set quite comfortably. And then in 2008, my greatest heartbreak watching all of sport, he does it. He climbs the mountaintop. He conquers perhaps, maybe that's debatable now, perhaps the greatest champion at the time on the grass surface, and the greatest player of all time in many people's minds on his favorite surface at that 2008 Wimbledon. And then he goes on to win at the Australian. He goes on to win at the US Open. He adds the Olympic title to his trophy cabinet. And this is a guy who was just a relentless winner. For him to have 22 slams, as close as he is to the all-time record with Djokovic, having missed as many slams as he did, in terms of slams that he did not even participate in, or slams where he was not quite fully healthy, it's remarkable. It's remarkable. His numbers are absolutely crazy, Chuck. Absolutely one of the greats. He's very firmly in that conversation as the greatest tennis player of all time, maybe the greatest athlete of all time. And we're privileged to see Rafael Nadal play, even if you are a Roger Federer guy and he broke your heart as many times as he did. That's the other thing, that Nadal as a character, as a personality, wasn't someone you hated, even though you recognize him as a rival.
Yep.
You did not hate him. You did not necessarily root against him. And all around, what a great ambassador he has been to the game of tennis.
He was lovable like N'Golo Kante, but because he won so much, you're like, he beat you into submission eventually, because you have to applaud the greatness that is Nadal. Also, I want to say, mentality-wise, man, one of the strongest minds, because I think akin to boxing, tennis finals are the most tense events you could watch, because I can feel the tension while I'm on the other side of the world watching from a screen. I'm like, yeah, no, Ziabuyala. And then you find him never quitting, because at some point, the greats, at some point, they drop a set and they quit. By quit, I mean they relinquish points that they shouldn't. Not Nadal. No, if there's a point to be fought for, he'll fight for it. Whether it's the first set, whether it's the fifth set, whether it's a tie break, whatever, he's going to fight for it. And eventually, it translates to 22 titles. So that is greatness.